Space Garfield! Garfield, what are you doing in space?
Space John, captain of the Muncie cruiser, piloted his ship across the stars. His space dog, Space Odie, happily sat next to him, wagging his tail out of excitement. I can't wait to get to the veterinarian planet! Space John beamed to Space Odie. I can't believe Space Liz hasn't met you yet! Space Odie released a bark of joyous anticipation. Space John's demeanor abruptly changed as his head sank into his hand. I still don't get why Space Garfield refuses to meet her anymore. Space John's lovable space cat slept on his luxurious space cat bed just a few feet away. The Muncie cruiser was not a big ship whatsoever, in comparison to how spaceships are depicted in many other fake science fiction scenarios. Rather, it was approximately the size of a suburban house. Space John yawned, his body finally catching up to his lack of sleep. Well, Space Odie, I'm going to hit the hay! He switched the Muncie cruiser to autopilot. When I wake up, we'll be at the veterinarian planet with my dear Space Liz. As the love-struck Space John waddled to his room, he explained, You'll love Space Liz! She's a veterinarian! I guess that much was already explained, considering the planet we're going to. Huh. The door to his room automatically opened, detecting his presence. Good night, Space Odie! He stepped into his room and the door sealed behind him. As soon as the lights to the Muncie cruiser dimmed, Space Garfield arose.
I sleep too much for Space John to realize when I'm just faking it,
Space Garfield remarked as he stretched his arms. Upon seeing that Space Garfield had awakened, Space Odie leaped on top of him and, without hesitation, delivered a wet, slimy kiss upon his face.
Get off me.
He pried Space Odie off. Space Odie didn't stop smiling, though. Space Garfield meandered over to the control panel and stood on the captain's chair with a cheeky grin.
If there's one thing I've made clear to Space John, it's that I'll never be put through Space Liz's torture again. Why? She should be arrested for the amount of needles she carries with her. And what do I get after all of it? Nothing. Just a good job and no lollipop. Believe me, I know how to get something better.
He turned off the autopilot and grabbed the wheel in his paws. He maneuvered the Muncie cruiser precisely 81 degrees to the right and set a course for a more special planet. Space Odie dashed to join Space Garfield at his side before letting out a concerned bark.
If Space John didn't want to go to the lasagna planet, then he should have been here to stop me. Don't worry. The lasagna planet is only a few light years away from the veterinarian planet. If you're so worried, then you can pilot it when I'm in my food coma.
Space Odie, although worried about Space John's feelings, always agreed to Space Garfield's plans. I mean, what else could he say? Nothing, because dogs can't talk. Not long after the two's exchange, the Muncie cruiser had arrived at its unexpected destination. Space Garfield leaned on the window while drooling at the glorious sight. A planet made entirely of lasagna. A fat orange space cat's dream! The way the yellow-orange color blended together made it shine brighter than any star. Just thinking of it would make anyone salivate. Space Garfield couldn't help but want to just fall out of his ship and embrace himself into the planet, wrapping layers of the pasta over his fur like warm blankets. Space Garfield, in total excitement, hopped down from the window and zipped into his spacesuit in a blink-and-it's-over moment. He opened the hatch built into the floor and gave his spacesuit's cord to Space Odie.
Alright, Space Odie. All you need to do is slowly lower me onto the planet and pull me up when I tug on the cord twice. You think you can handle that even with your tiny space dog brain?
Space Odie put one paw on his forehead to salute to Space Garfield, exemplifying his determination. His tongue peering out the side of his mouth exemplified his dopiness. Space Garfield leaped down the hatch. Space Odie, cord in his mouth, gently lowered him. On his way down, Space Garfield held his arms wide open, welcoming the lasagna's first contact. One thing that's very important to the story is that this isn't merely Jim Davis's 1978 hit comic creation Garfield. This is Space Garfield. He has technology so advanced that if he touches a food item with the glove of his spacesuit, it teleports to the inside of his spacesuit if he so commands. Finally, Space Garfield had fully descended upon the planet of his dreams. He manically laughed as he rolled around the lasagna. He played and ate like he had never played and eaten before. Space Garfield's moment of triumph lasted only a few minutes until, while laying on a pile of lasagna, he spotted another ship hovering above the planet. Space Garfield groaned to himself, immediately recognizing it.
What is he doing here?
From the new ship popped out the adorable and equally aggravating Space Nermal. He elegantly floated onto the planet. He ran over to Space Garfield, who begrudgingly stood up to confront him.
Hiya, Space Garfield!
Space Nermal tried to embrace Space Garfield with a hug, but was instantly rejected.
What are you doing here?
Space Garfield asked with his regular monotonous voice.
My owner fell asleep, so I thought to myself, gee, I wonder what my great buddy Space Garfield is up to. Then I thought, I know! He's probably at the Lasagna Planet, his favorite place in the whole universe.
A whole universe, and I still have to run into you.
There's no need to be so grouchy, Space Garfield. We can both share the lasagna.
This is my planet. Find your own.
He turned his back and sauntered away. Space Nermal scooped up a handful of lasagna and hollered in youthful pride,
Hey, why don't we play a game?
He threw the handful of lasagna at Space Garfield's back. After it hit him, Space Garfield simply stopped. He slowly turned around and looked directly at Space Nermal. Space Garfield's face was as expressionless as ever, but his eyes showed all the rage that bottled inside. He began marching over to Space Nermal, who suddenly became predictably regretful.
Wait, hold on! I was just joking!
Space Garfield towered over Space Nermal. He picked up a much larger handful of lasagna, opened the top of Space Nermal's spacesuit for just a second, and stuffed the lasagna down his suit.
You don't get to waste my lasagna.
Space Garfield headed off in the opposite direction. Rightfully embarrassed, Space Nermal whipped out a remote that he was keeping in the back pocket of his spacesuit. An extendable claw protruded from his spaceship.
Hey, Space Garfield!
Space Garfield didn't turn around. He didn't have time for Space Nermal's meaningless antics.
This'll teach you not to mess with the little guys!
He pushed another button on his remote. The claw swiftly scooped up Space Garfield and tensed to a point in which there was no escape for him. It shot above the planet to a point where, still dreary, Space Garfield was forced to turn around.
Space Nermal,
He dully shouted.
let me down from here.
No!
Space Nermal's eyes concealed a wicked passion.
Let's see how you like it!
With another button push, the claw motioned backwards. Space Garfield frantically tugged on his cord. Space Odie attempted to pull him up to no avail. The claw wound backwards, creaked, and instantaneously propelled forwards. Space Garfield was spat out. His cord ripped, his only grip on life being the emergency oxygen stored in a suit. The immense force and speed that Space Garfield was flying at caused him to pass out. Space Garfield was strolling within a white void. He was the only thing there. He muttered,
This is just great.
as a white bubble with black text appeared above him, repeating his words in blocky letters. He kept walking, but didn't move. He felt himself suddenly shift to the right. His room was endless, but he was still trapped to the confines of a square. He gave up and sat down.
I'll just stay here then.
Space Garfield.
A mysterious voice called out to him. He stood up at hearing this wondrous sound. His ears tingled.
Whose beautiful voice is that?
Space Garfield.
The voice repeated. An angel with wings as soft as Space Garfield's bottom appeared in front of him. A bright halo illuminated her stretched, pink face. Her neck was long, but weirdly it attracted Space Garfield. Her paws felt like soft gold. As she appeared, the background filled with a bright blue color. The floor turned into a darker blue as to differentiate the two. Upon seeing the angel, Space Garfield's eyes turned into hearts. Space Garfield's jaw dropped and his eyes sprung out of his head.
What's your name?
My name is Arlene.
Heavenly voices echoed her name.
Wow, you look like an angel.
That's because I am. Space Garfield, do you remember what happened to you?
As he tried to remember, his eyes reverted to normal.
Oh yeah, Space Nermal won, and I got stuck here.
That is correct. But Space Garfield, you can't give up.
And why not? He's already taken both my lasagna and my dignity.
Why not? Because you're Space Garfield. This is your story to be the hero of. Space Nermal invaded your planetary sanctuary, but he is weak. His technology defeated you. His anger defeated you, but not his wits. You're better than him, Space Garfield. I know it. Once you get your planet back, we can eat there together.
Arlene's words formed into a physical bubble. After her sweet voice rang throughout his ears, Space Garfield reread her message again and again. He became inspired.
You're right, Arlene. That planet is mine, and I'm going to get it back.
Space Garfield watched Arlene in awe. She had saved him. Space Garfield finally found someone he loved as much as lasagna. He began running to hug her, and she ran in reciprocation. Their arms were wide open. As soon as he got close enough to hug her, he woke up.
Oh, It was just a dream.
Despite his rude awakening, Space Garfield still felt encouraged by the angel in his dream. Was she made up? Was it a real angel that had visited his dream? He didn't have time to think about that now. He needed to cease his motivation to return to the lasagna planet and... Wait, where was he anyway? He looked around. There were roads, houses, and hospitals that all looked vaguely familiar, but Space Garfield didn't focus on that. He instead paid attention to the nearby sun starting to rise, which meant that Space John would wake up soon. If Space John found him outside of the Muncie Cruiser, he would be in deep trouble. Who knows what Space John might do? Stop baking lasagna? Space Garfield didn't want to risk the possibilities. Finally, Space Garfield discovered his location when he glanced up to the sky and saw a constellation that spelled out Veterinarian Planet.
Wonderful. Out of all places, I'm trapped here.
He started pacing around.
Now I'm stuck here with no way of getting home because of the ordinance that space cats can't own spaceships. The space humans can own spaceships, so can other terrestrial life forms, but space cats? Nope.
Space Garfield kicked a pebble across the road.
Stuck on the veterinarian planet of all places. I'll tell ya, I don't even know anyone here. The only one I do know is...
Space Garfield had an idea. A mischievous idea. Using the geographical knowledge he had gained on Space John's multitude of visits, Space Garfield tracked down Space Liz's house. Note that the veterinarian planet was not big. It was nearly identical in size to a regular large city on Earth. The only real difference was that it was spherical. The laws to classify a planet as a planet have changed extremely from the ancient year of 2020. Out of breath, Space Garfield arrived in the driveway of Space Liz's house. He didn't run, and it wasn't far from where he landed. He was just a fat space cat. Space Liz's spaceship was much smaller than that of Space John's and looked like an ordinary earthen car. It was locked, but, with a devilish smile, Space Garfield unpicked the lock with his claw. He opened the door and nestled himself into the captain's chair. In the passenger seat, Space Garfield spotted some of Space Liz's medical supplies, including the nausea-inducing needles. However, if he was going to get back to the lasagna planet, he would need to deal with it.
Space Liz won't mind that I'm borrowing her spaceship.
Space Garfield activated the control panel, revved the spaceship, and shot out of the veterinarian planet's orbit.
Probably.
Space Garfield was heading in the direction of the lasagna planet, but kept looking over at the sun closest to him. It was rising upon the surface of adjacent planets. At this rate, he wouldn't be at the lasagna planet by the time the sun was up. Not only would he get in trouble with Space John, but Space Nermal would have claimed the planet for himself! From seemingly out of nowhere, a small voice piped,
Psst, I can't believe how slow Spaceless is going, yo.
Space Garfield's fur rose out of shock. He hadn't expected there to be anyone on the spaceship with him. He looked behind him to see a cage full of space mice. The space mice looked back.
Why don't you get it to go faster then, huh?
Okay, you just have to let us out of this cage first.
Space Garfield was startled by their willingness to this rhetorical offer, but was open to it. He opened the space mice's cage and they all piled out. The space mouse that had been talking to Space Garfield decided to introduce himself.
My name's Space Squeak. Cheese to meet ya.
He stuck his paw out. Space Garfield shook it with just one of his claws. His paw was as big as the space mouse after all.
So, how do you plan to make this go any faster?
Like this.
Headed by Space Squeak, the space mice wedged themselves into a panel nearby the controls. They bit through some wires, reconnected some others. A bunch of technical stuff too descriptive to explain. Once finished, Space Squeak shouted,
Get ready.
In a flash of light, he touched two exposed wires together. For an instant, hyperspeed was activated. Space Garfield forcefully sunk into the back of his chair. His cheeks on his face flapped behind him. For a brief moment, he saw Angel Arlene again. After barely a second, he was hovering over the lasagna planet once more. His fur was ruffled, but the space mice seemed unaffected. In fact, they seemed amused by the recent adventure. They casually climbed out of the panel.
Whoa.
Space Garfield managed to say as he pulled himself out of the cushions of the seat.
Did that help?
Space Squeak innocently asked. Space Garfield nodded his head.
Great!
Space Garfield recovered from the initial effects of hyperspeed, took his helmet off to clean his fur, and prepared himself. He was going to reclaim the lasagna planet for himself.
What do you need from us now?
The space mice stared intently at Space Garfield.
Oh, that was it.
Space Garfield casually responded. The space mice were caught off guard by his answer. They whispered amongst themselves. In creepy unison, they turned to Space Squeak, who spoke for the entire group.
Can we have the spaceship for ourselves?
Space Squeak requested.
Sure, it's not mine.
The space mice cheered. To make sure they heard Space Garfield correctly, and in disbelief, they asked him again.
Really?
Yeah, you can have everything in here.
The space mice celebrated!
Actually, I'm going to take this.
Space Garfield opened the door of the spaceship. As he departed the space mice with a laid-back,
Have fun.
he plunged to the lasagna planet's surface, hiding something behind his back. He slowly made his strides across the planet. He carefully orchestrated each step, as if his feet were too heavy and if he didn't, he would fall down. At long last, Space Garfield encountered
Space Nermal.
Space Garfield?
Space Nermal jumped as he turned around to face the gnarly beast. He was in a terrified panic.
What are you doing back here?
He tried to reach behind him to feel for his remote.
I just want to play your game.
Oh!
Space Nermal stopped reaching for his remote. Though he could hold petty grudges, he could also be easily delighted.
You should have just said so!
Why don't you start?
Space Garfield carried a sadistic look in his eyes.
Okay!
Space Nermal threw a ball of lasagna at Space Garfield. It hit him. Space Garfield took a step closer.
Go again.
He indicated. Space Nermal did so. The white in Space Garfield's eyes grew.
Again.
Space Nermal hit him. His smile grew wider.
Fun. My turn.
With what he had behind his back, Space Garfield scooped up a handful of lasagna into a ball-like formation. He chuckled as he threw it at Space Nermal. It hit him in the arm. Space Garfield's smile extended like a madman's.
Wow, is this far? Far.
Space Nermal's knees wobbled. He was barely keeping consciousness. Space Garfield approached him. Space Nermal fell to his knees. Space Garfield enjoyed his pitiful display. It looked like Space Nermal was weeping for mercy.
What's the matter, Space Nermal?
Space.
The lasagna stuck to the sleeve of his spacesuit fell off. It revealed a tranquilizing needle that punctured through Space Nermal's spacesuit into his arm.
Garfield.
Space Nermal fell over onto his stomach as his eyelids closed. As the sun was about to wholly come up, Space Garfield grabbed the remote from the back of Space Nermal's spacesuit. He raised his eyebrows twice in the cockiest way possible.
He got lucky yesterday. He fought me on a Monday. Monday left me broken.
Space Garfield yawned.
I'm ready to get back to bed.
He pushed buttons to control the claw similar to how Space Nermal did so before. Instead of flinging himself to a new planet, he used the claw to raise himself back through the Muncie Cruiser's hatch.
I've got to get myself one of these.
Upon his return, Space Odie abundantly licked his face.
Alright, cut it out.
Space Odie then issued a sound that showed his confusion as to why Space Nermal was lying face down on the lasagna planet.
You're right. We shouldn't leave him there.
Space Garfield once again controlled the claw to pick up Space Nermal. Just as Space Nermal had done to him before, the claw flung Space Nermal toward the veterinarian planet, with just enough time for Space Garfield to put the remote in Space Nermal's back pocket before he left for his trip. What? He wasn't a monster. After a few seconds, Space Nermal had disappeared.
Finally.
While Space John unsuspectingly dressed himself in his room, Space Garfield closed the hatch, took off his spacesuit and threw it to the side of the room, and curled up in his bed with his blanket over him. As he cuddled his Pookie and drifted off to sleep, Space John walked out of his room. Space Odie greeted him with excited yips and yaps. He jumped up to Space John's legs. Space John lovingly pet him. "Good morning, boy!" Space John gushed. Space Odie leapt down so the two could walk to the captain's chair together. As Space John passed by Space Garfield, he giggled to himself. "Oh, that space cat! Does he ever do anything besides sleep?" Space Garfield opened one eye, looked at Space John, rolled his eyes, then went back to sleep. As Space John sat in his chair, with Space Odie sat at his side, he noticed that he was at the lasagna planet. "How did that happen?" He looked back at Space Garfield, considering the possibility. "No, that couldn't be it." He turned back around. "The autopilot must have malfunctioned. I'll have to get that checked out." He calculated a new route. "I wonder how long it's going to take to get to the... Oh no! Jeepers! Space Liz! Space John realized his mistake too late, since the control panel flashed red with the text, "Call from Space Liz," heart emoji, under a telephone icon. Space John answered the phone in a panic. "Hello, Space Liz!"
Space John,
demanded Space Liz. A holographic live feed of her face displayed across the window that once gazed upon the lasagna planet.
where are you?
"I know I'm going to be very..." He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Very late for our date, but hear me out. I have a good reason." She paused. There was an iciness to her voice.
Fine, let's hear it then. What's your excuse this time?
"I went to sleep with the autopilot set to go to your home, but when I woke up, I was here."
Oh, really? And where is here?
The lasagna planet.
The what?
Wait, it's not what it sounds.
The lasagna planet? So you decided to skip out on having breakfast without telling me just to go to that carb-filled planet? A food that you, coincidentally, make constantly for your space cat?
She mockingly laughed.
He needs to go on a diet, by the way.
No! I told you what happened already! Also, Space Liz, is everything alright? You seem tense.
Space John mumbled to himself.
More tense than usual.
I am tense.
Space Liz sighed.
Thank you for noticing. I woke up to find my spaceship stolen, and now I'm having to deal with this whole situation. Look,
She sighed again while regaining her composure.
just get over here as soon as you can.
You sound really upset. Maybe we should just reschedule.
She considered her options.
Yeah, that would be best.
She immediately hung up.
It's a good thing I got out of that one.
Space John smiled as he looked over at Space Odie.
Come on, boy. Let's have our own space adventure.
He pet his adoring space dog again. He proceeded to lead the Muncie cruiser away from the oddly appearing lasagna planet and took off. As he left, he could hear the frustrated screams of Space Lyman calling for Space Nermal and the adjacent ship. They were like a lullaby that cradled Space Garfield into his next nap.
Space Garfield. What are you? Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. What are you doing?
What are you doing in space?
What are you doing? What are you doing?
What are you doing in space?
What are you?
Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield. Garfield. Space Garfield. Space Garfield.